Good afternoon and welcome to Sound Off, the North County's local talk forum and the longest-running radio talk show in the county. Sound Off is here to allow you to participate, discussing the issues and ideas of the times. The opinions expressed on Sound Off are those of the speaker and don't necessarily reflect those of KPRL's staff or management. Now here's your host for this afternoon, Sound Off, Ron Fisher.
I think we all have heard of Hearst Castle, whether you live in this area or not, but there may be some little tidbits about it that you don't know about, and that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. Joe, it was just a few days ago, what day is this? Last Tuesday, I guess it was a week ago today, was the 40th anniversary of the state of California owning the Hearst Castle. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about maybe some history of it and what's going on with the celebration that's going on for some time. Our guests this afternoon are two. Their names are Deborah Clay and Mova Verde, and they are both working with Hearst Castle, and they know everything there is possibly to know about the castle and William Randolph Hearst. Thanks for being with us. Appreciate you doing it.
Happy to be here.
Driving all the way over that big old hill there. Let me throw our numbers out if you have any questions, comments. 238-5775, 238-KPRL. Just to get us started here, since this is the 40th of the acquisition of the monument, it has 40 different names. The ranch,
that's right. Yes, it
National
does.
Monument, the Hearst Castle, all of that stuff.
The former is Hearst and Simeon State Historical Monument.
We'll call it Hearst Castle. How did that happen? How did the state get a hold of this?
It was a gift from the Hearst Corporation family. I know that there's lots of factors of why they gave it to the state, but I think in Hearst's will, which is sealed now, it's one of the longest wills in the state of California, it was intended to go to the public in some way. I know at one point that it was offered, I think, to the universities of California. And at the end of 1957 is when it was donated, about 120 acres, a little bit more than that, acreage on the hilltop and down below. And we opened up for tours on June 2nd, 1958.
Now, do we know what his actual motivation was? Was it a tax thing for his family?
There's no doubt that there was an enormous expense to run that place. And you have to keep in mind, I think, that that was not a family home. Hearst built that when his sons were pretty well grown, at least most of them were. They were born and raised on the East Coast. It's not that they did not spend time at the castle, but they didn't spend a lot of time there. It was a home that he shared mostly with his companion of many years, Marion Davies, and their friends who visited them there. So when Hearst died, what the corporation, who by that time owned it and had since the 1930s, it became a corporate asset back in the late 1930s, was a great big money-eating white elephant that the family spent very little time in. Again, based the family New Yorkers. And, corporations by definition are there as money makers, and Hearst Castle certainly didn't make any money for the corporation. And a combination of that and higher taxes. And on top of that, I think times have changed. Hearst Castle was really the last in the long line of enormous homes and estates built by American millionaires of the late 19th century and very, very early 20th century who made enormous fortunes and paid very, very little taxes. And Hearst Castle was kind of the last in that line. And of course, by 1951, he began it in 1920. By 1951, when he died, we'd been through a terrible depression, horrendous Second World War. Hearst Castle was no longer in its context. The world was different. Taxes were different. People looked at the world differently, and I just think that, I don't think by 1951 living in that style was really quite as acceptable as it had been in, pre-World War I days and pre-Depression days. So I think it was a combination of money, of taxes, and of Hearst's genuine desire that that place one day serve a public function. And he had expressed that many times. So I think it was a combination of reasons that went to 6.5 years after his death, that being given to the state by the corporation.
Now, did he actually live there full-time, or was this sort of a retreat for him?
Between 1928 and 1938, that was his primary residence, although he might have spent as little as 3 to 6 months there a year.
He had many other gorgeous estates that he loved, too, that he spent time at in New York. A 12th century castle in Wales, property in Mexico.
That's
beautiful.
where the big ranch was.
Yeah, that's where the big
big one.
ranch was, yes.
About almost 1 million acres.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
In the state of Chihuahua. That's where most of the cattle was.
Yeah, because this is big. I was fortunate enough at one point to go out with a group, and we were actually able to go out there, and we were driving and driving and driving, and it never ended.
At 250,000 acres, the San Simeon Ranch was dwarfed by the Chihuahua, Mexico property.
That was one of Mr. Hearst's favorite activities, was horseback riding. He loved to take his guests horseback riding.
And he, as most people I think know, from the late teens through the late 30s, he was very involved in movie production in Hollywood. So a lot of his time also had to be spent down in Hollywood, Los Angeles area. So he traveled around, but I think the way we put it is that San Simeon was considered his main residence between about 1928 and 1938.
I would venture to say that it was probably his favorite home.
Absolutely.
No, he had a lot of visitors.
enjoyed
He had a lot of visitors, Hollywood stars, and all of that sort of thing. What was it actually like at that time for them to get there? How did they get there? And
It was a long trip. There was no Highway 1 completed until 1937. And it might take probably about 5 hours from San Francisco or Los Angeles today, and I think then it probably took closer to 10 hours. Some guests were allowed to fly in, and where the visitor center is located today, that's where the original airport was. And then it was moved in the 40s when he started buying larger planes.
And actually, most of the guests probably arrived by train. He had the luxurious Pullman cars. The guests would board in Glendale, usually if they were coming from down south, take the train to San Luis Obispo, and he would either have private cars or a taxi service that he contracted with, pick the guests up in San Luis Obispo and drive them the rest of the way to San Simeon. But again, as Mova said, no Highway 1 until 1937. So 15 years of bringing people over one lane, dirt, mud, ditches, gullies, no lights. And as Julia Morgan said once, she wouldn't wish that, Julia Morgan being the architect, she said, I wouldn't wish that trip from the train station up here on my worst enemy. She said in the wintertime, it's one long continuous skid back and forth in the mud.
so were they spending then large amounts of time there? I mean, it doesn't sound to me like something that you would go to for a weekend.
Oh, you're absolutely correct. I think most of the guests that were invited had an open invitation, and most of them planned to stay probably 3 or 4 days, and some even stayed weeks. A lot of it depended on how much Mr. Hearst enjoyed your company.
He told you when to get there. Didn't tell you when to leave unless you got the hint that maybe he was getting tired of you at some point, but open-ended invitations.
Now, was it a party-type atmosphere? Was he...
I think more so on the weekends, when there would be more people there at one time, because there would be guests coming and going. And I think that when there was larger groups, and they had, special plans, and certainly there was a certain schedule they followed. The evening meal was served rather late, and then there was always a movie played. And, of course, a lot of the movies shown there were Marion Davies movies.
But as far as the partying goes, Hearst himself was a relatively conservative man. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He loved to throw parties. He did not like open, sloppy drunkenness. He didn't use... he wanted you to watch your language. He watched his. He really didn't like off-color language. He loved to surround himself with good storytellers, good mimics, but keep the stories relatively clean. So Hearst was a relatively conservative man in some ways. And keep in mind generally that Hearst was generally much older than most of his guests. Hearst is entertaining at San Simeon in his 60s, 70s, and 80s. And most of his guests are coming from Hollywood. Sometimes they're teenagers. They're 20s, 30s, 40-year-olds. So I think people probably respecting, their host's different generation. Although they had fun and they certainly partied up there, it wasn't wild, drunken, stuff going on. You did have to retain, I think, some decorum.
In many ways. I mean, the man was born in 1865, and the social standards were so different.
Yeah, well, that's why I asked, because
Right.
he certainly has a reputation of being a conservative, at least politically,
yes.
kind of guy.
Yeah.
Actually wasn't politically conservative when he was young. He was really quite liberal, shockingly so to some people. But as he got older, he got more conservative. But there's, I think, a perception sometimes of his of being very uptight or very Victorian. He had a fabulous sense of humor. He liked to dance.
And he yodeled.
And he
yodeling.
Yeah.
Some guests that we've interviewed over the years have talked about things, the way Hearst dressed, how casual he was, how much fun he could be dancing and yodeling. And I think that the guests that were invited were typically people like Charlie Chaplin, that was somebody that was fun, lighthearted. Cary Grant was probably invited there more than any other guest.
Many, many times.
You mentioned people that you interviewed, and I have wondered how you people learn all of this stuff. It's almost like you were there yourself. How do you go about training to learn these things?
There's approximately 150 oral history interviews, and most of them were done in the 70s and the 80s. And they were interviews of former employees, former guests. In fact, if you've read the Tribune for the last few days, David Nassau's book concentrates on those oral histories, and they're fascinating. And maybe their memories weren't always correct, but I think that they're insightful about the way Hearst was and the way the lifestyle was.
So we're fortunate, we have a lot of personal accounts to draw from.
So you actually have like a little mini college there for people who go to work?
We have an excellent resource library, wonderful staff library.
Every time I go there or have gone there, I have seen some sort of construction, or maybe it was renovation going on.
Renovation.
Is that what it is?
Yes.
Did he ever finish what the vision was?
No, and that is interesting you bring it up, because when they gave it as a gift, the agreement was never to complete it, never to add anything to it, but to leave it as William Randolph Hearst left it. And
there's much of it unfinished.
Yeah.
Mostly exteriors. Almost all interiors got done, although there was a whole other wing of the house that he wanted to build that he never even got started. So it's mostly exterior cosmetic work that didn't get finished, but there's a lot of that didn't get finished.
Was this other wing bedrooms, or did he have some other types of rooms?
The south wing is the service wing, and that's where the kitchen is, and the upper floors were intended to be permanent housing for the employees. And then the north wing is more complete, and you see that on Tour 3. And it obviously has a lot more different influence from the 40s as far as the interior design and even the furniture.
And the wing that he never started was going to be called the East Wing, probably, and that was to be the grand ballroom, probably about 4,000 square feet, grand ballroom, probably a tapestry hall, a couple other, but you never knew. Just because this was his idea going in, never meant that when they finished it, that's what it was going to be.
He was prone to change his mind quite a bit.
Yes, he was.
And there's thousands of letters between the architect Julia Morgan and Hearst. In fact, at Cal Poly, there's a special collections section in the library that has a lot of her drawings, and also there's correspondence. And I think that's very insightful. If you've ever seen the movie at National Geographic Theater, that covers a lot of the information about how Hearst got started, what inspired the building on the hilltop.
One of the most fascinating things about Hearst Castle is the relationship between William Randolph Hearst and Julia Morgan, the architect. It lasted for decades. It was always respectful. They admired each other. They respected each other. They never called each other anything but Miss Morgan and Mr. Hearst. They were both formal people. But the relationship between the two of them was incredible.
They were both very much dreamers, and I think if it hadn't been the combination of those two people, and of course Hearst was fortunate to inherit millions of dollars, and the fact that he loved to collect art, it was that special combination is why that happened.
Was there any rhyme or reason to or a theme to Hearst Castle? As you go in different rooms and it kind of looks different. Is there any sort of through line there?
There's much more of a continuity than you think at first glance. He wanted it to fit into the sort of natural Spanish history of California, so that's why the Spanish style of the buildings, that's why the sort of village atmosphere at the top with the guest houses sitting in a semicircle around the main house to give it kind of a hilltop Spanish village feel. The artworks inside are, for the most part, and you're right, there's a big range there in age and countries of origin, but it's mainly it's Baroque, it's Renaissance, it's Gothic. Most of what's in there is Spanish or Italian. Of course, there are exceptions, but there's mostly Spanish and Italian. So he definitely, the style at the time in California was to kind of build mission style.